What you're about to watch and listen to is a collection of our experiences learning and in life, and a breakdown of why those experiences are applicable to us becoming teachers later and how they can be understood in context of different important parts of the class that we've all been through. So without further ado, we'll jump right into some ideas from Katie on identity.
Another course-focusing issue is identity. James Marcia proposed 4 identity stages that can occur during identity development. At each stage, it is defined on the level of commitment and choice from someone, based on their experiences and circumstances that can ultimately impact the stage's outcome. James Marcia defines choice or crisis as the adolescent being actively involved in choosing their own beliefs and individuality. Commitment is defined as a degree of investment by an individual towards their sense of self. The first identity stage is identity achievement. This is characterized by passing the identity crisis towards high commitment and autonomy. This status is associated with balanced thinking, high intimacy, high achievement motivations, high self-esteem, and basically when the individual finalizes who they are. Second, identity moratorium is characterized by high crisis and making choices prior to full commitment. The individual is taking proactive steps towards autonomy in their identity, however, they can experience higher levels of anxiety and uncertainty as they still do not know who they want to be. Identity foreclosure is characterized by having a low choice but high commitment. This usually is a result of having very little exploration after committing to their identity. It will result in tendencies of authoritarianism and closed-mindedness. Lastly, identity diffusion is characterized by having low choice and low commitment that shows a lack of maturity and concern about one's self and future. This will have results in having low self-esteem and autonomy, as well as having a very disorganized external locus of control. My freshman and sophomore year of high school, I was really into taking art classes. My art teacher empowered my creativity, and I was comfortable and proud with the art I was creating. While taking these art classes, it was contributing to my identity status, and I felt like I was uncovering a different version of myself, and I was really happy. However, my parents' authoritarian parenting styles told me I couldn't have a career in art since I wouldn't be able to support myself, and they pretty much destroyed any dream or future I had with art after high school. But I continued to take art classes during the rest of my years in high school, and during my senior year, I was taking AP Studio Art, scoring a 5 on the AP exam. I designed my school's graduation pamphlet. I had my artwork displayed in multiple art shows throughout the state, and I was recognized in my town paper for a community art project I was working on. Although my parents' authoritarian parenting styles diminished my dreams, continuing to take art classes influenced my identity exploration as I was exposed to different experiences that I wouldn't have else been exposed to. Art contributed to my identity moratorium and eventually my independence. A key takeaway from James Marcia's identity stages is that the interplay of choice and commitment affects various dimensions of personality and social behavior, especially in the context of family and educational settings.
Something that I noticed more and more as we went through this course was that all of the different concepts that we covered were connected in one way or another. That said, I think one of the most important things that plays with identity and comes with forming identity is risk-taking. So our next part is going to be about risk-taking and cognitive development, most specifically risk-taking, though. In order to understand why risk-taking is important and how it can be applied in context, we have to understand a couple of different factors that are involved with risk-taking. I split these two into biological and psychological factors just because that's how it made sense to me. So let's talk about this. First, in biological, when it comes to risk-taking in biology, we're talking about the development of new neural pathways, the development of new brain area, not new brain areas, but the development of brain areas, and also the presence or lack of presence of specific neurotransmitters, most importantly, dopamine and serotonin. So to the first bullet, experience expectant and dependent neural pathways. These are things that your brain either creates and expects that you'll use them, such as auditory pathways. It expects that you'll be hearing and listening to things, so those pathways are made when you're very young, and if you don't use them, they'll disappear. Neural dependent pathways are things that are created by doing something. So if you're a pianist, you're going to have neural pathways that other pianists aren't going to have because you've practiced the piano, and you'll have things that allow you to use your hands together in complex ways that other people might not have been able to create. But you also might not have the pathways that a snowboarder has to do the motions and things that they need to do in snowboarding. And this also applies to other cognitive things that aren't specifically physical. At the same time, lots of kids are developing, all adolescents, I should say, are developing their frontal lobe, their amygdala, and many other parts of their brains. But we're going to focus on the frontal lobe and also the amygdala, but the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe that are involved with decision making. It's important to remember that these parts of the brain are under development and under heavy development during adolescence, and so it might be difficult for students to make decisions that are not impulsive and not well and are well thought through. So keep that in mind. A final thing to talk about on the biological factor, though there are more things, this is the one last one I'm going to talk about, is dopamine. Dopamine is the happy juice in your brain that makes you feel good. Dopamine is very linked with risk and risk behavior, most specifically because lots of students are very susceptible to dopamine, and they have a lot of it in adolescence. And oftentimes when students are stressed, that can negatively affect their dopamine levels, and therefore stressed students who do not have dopamine as much as other students do are more likely to take greater and more risks so they can release more dopamine. So now to talk about some less hard science-y factors, which I called psychological factors, that it's not the greatest name for it. Either way, risk-taking can help adolescents form identity. That is, their experience with the new, their experience with the unexpected, any experience that they have that's their own choice to do, their own risk to take, helps boost their autonomy and boost their sense of identity separate from other factors like their parents or other people involved in those non-risky aspects of their life. That is to say that like other people can certainly be involved in forming that identity. People can, peer pressure and other things like that can force people into doing risks, but it's ultimately very tied with identity formation. Also, because of the development of the frontal lobe and other associated areas, a lot of teens don't understand why they take certain risks or make certain decisions. They just do. It's kind of like they don't really have that pathway fully formed to make very thoughtful and not very impulsive decisions, and so they don't always have an explanation for what they're doing. The final thing I want to talk about is that there is this concept of acceptable and unacceptable risk. Acceptable risk is risk that doesn't have major long-term consequences and can also be beneficial for people that take it. Unacceptable risk is something that could have a long-term consequence for those that take it. So I would say that doing heroin or something like that, well, certainly risky and maybe can release a lot of dopamine for someone, is not an acceptable risk because it has a lot of consequences that can appear down the road, like addiction. So with all of that in mind, I'd like to talk about some experiences that I've had with risk-taking. Though this isn't really things that I've done because I'm not a very risky person, and I think it's not super easy for me to break down a lot of that stuff of my life. That said, I was a swim instructor for a couple of years in high school, and one of the interesting and honestly more fun parts of my job was I got to teach private lessons to students that were, older than the average swim trainee. A lot of my students were in elementary school, 5 years old, 6 years old. But occasionally I got to teach students that were in high school how to swim. I didn't know any of them, but it was a very, very fascinating experience. Because the thing with learning how to swim when you're older is mechanically it's not the most difficult thing to do. The hardest part about it is the fear. A lot of people don't learn how to swim, and they become afraid of sinking in the water because, by that time they've probably tried to swim at some point, though not all have, and they usually have developed some sort of fear of the water. So one of the hardest parts about teaching someone how to swim when they're older is helping them break past that barrier. So how does that have to do with risk taking? Well, I had one student who had this exact problem. They're very fit, they were on the track team and all that, but they never learned how to swim. So we had to figure out a way to help them get past that. And that's the thing with risk taking, it's very individual. Some people may see risk taking as jumping off of a cliff into the water. And for this one student of mine, they're a student. This risk was just going into the deep end and letting go of a flotation device for a little bit. And that's something that was really interesting to me because, that being able to do that really helped them benefit. They were very happy from being able to do something like that. And that taking that kind of risk is something that's super acceptable because it's positive. It's helping them form this autonomous identity that's like, hey, this is something that I can do. And it's something that I'm choosing to do. So helping them learn how to swim, helping them bridge that gap that they probably have with many of their friends was a really interesting experience. Because I got to see how they were processing that fear in front of me. And so, this student was slightly fearless because they had lessons before, but, they didn't really know how to float. That was one of the biggest things, was floating on their back. And I just had to be like, look, trust me, I'll be here to support you. And yet, it was very difficult for them to just totally calm down and relax, which is what you need to do if you need to get your body floating in the water. And even in the shallow end where you can touch, it doesn't feel like it's shallow when none of your body is touching the floor. So how can we incorporate this into the factors that we were talking about, other than what we've already done? Swimming is not an experience expectant pathway that we make. It's not like you're born to swim. It's something that you have to learn how to do in practice. And as we get older, it's much harder to do things like that. And so practicing and working harder and going at it over and over and over has really helped develop this person's this person's neural pathway to swim. And it was a hard road, but they were able to do it. But the general thing that I want to say about risk-taking and with all of these things is when it comes to students, they don't often know why they make decisions or how they make decisions, and they need guides to be able to take those risks properly. So, it would have been, and learning how to swim can be a very good example of that acceptable versus unacceptable risk. If he was like, I'm just going to jump into a lake where I can't touch the bottom and just go for it, that's obviously a very unacceptable risk because you're probably going to drown, and that can have very bad consequences like death. However, for lessons where you can slowly ramp up the difficulty and try new things with safety measures like guards and other things in place is super, super good. And this, I think, can be translated into many different things. So as teachers, it's very important to recognize that a lot of teens don't have the pathways to make the decisions on what's acceptable and what's not acceptable, or they're stressed and they need more dopamine and so they'll take more risks. So it's important for us to guide them and show them how they can be more productive in taking those risks and give them opportunities to take risks in a safe environment so they don't go reaching for unsafe risks outside of the environment that we provide.
The circle of courage provides the foundation for psychological resilience and positive youth development, especially for youth who are at risk. The spirit of belonging, or the universal need for human bonds, can be cultivated by relationships of trust. The significance is found in the acceptance, attention, and affection of others, and a strong sense of belonging makes young people feel more receptive to guidance from other community members. The spirit of mastery is where the children strive for mastery in their environments. When the child's needs to be competent is satisfied, motivation for achievement is enhanced. Such success and mastery produce social recognition as well as inner satisfaction for the child to say, "I can succeed." The spirit of independence is when young people need opportunities to develop skills and the confidence to assert positive self-discipline, so they can say, "I have the power to make decisions." An example of this can be when an unacceptable behavior is met with explanations of how others would be hurt or disappointed by their actions. Lastly, the spirit of generosity demonstrates the importance of being generous and unselfish, and by helping others, an individual will be able to create their own proof of worthiness as they make a positive contribution to another person's life. In 2017, it was my first time working at a summer camp where I was going to be a soccer coach working with kids who were 5 to 17 years old. During my first week at my coaches meeting, I was given the list of campers I was going to be working with for the week, and some of the older coaches started to complain to me about a camper named Michael who appeared on my list, who they've had multiple times in the past, and how he is such a pain to work with. Michael was a foster child who had been removed from multiple home settings, and he was only 7 years old. You could just see that he didn't want to be at the camp because he's been there so many times, and he always distanced himself from everyone else. When he would at least try to engage with some of the other campers in my group, they would always end up picking on him. I saw how he was struggling with fitting in and also striving in an environment where there were so many different skills and abilities of those other campers who played soccer. And so I tried working with him for the next week to make sure he felt belonged in the camp environment. I would always pick him to be on my team because I knew if the other coaches got him, they wouldn't play him and he would just sit on the side and be missing out on all the different learning experiences and social interactions with the other campers. During our breaks, like our water breaks, him and I would kick around a soccer ball and I would show him some fun moves he could try during our games. And I think by doing that, he felt more comfortable on the field, and I could see his motivation to play increased, as well as him showing other campers some of the moves I showed him. I just think overall, my camp experience and working with Michael, who was an at-risk youth from being moved around from so many different home settings and didn't have a sense of security, is an example of how the values of the circle of courage can help children succeed. And I can see Michael walked away during the last day of camp feeling more confident in his ability to make new relationships and also be more comfortable in some environments. The key takeaway from the circle of courage is that these 4 values, belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity, can serve as a base for working with every child and not just those who are at risk, but those who are at risk can benefit the most.
Another important aspect of social development is moral development, because the reasoning behind the actions we take will reflect what actions we take and will reflect how certain people see us in society. For example, people with poor moral development are likely to take less socially acceptable actions and therefore be less socially developed. So let's talk about some of the framework of moral development. This framework comes primarily from Lawrence Kohlberg and Carol Gilligan, who Kohlberg made the first structure of moral development, and then Gilligan, was like, your research only has boys. This is a little bit gendered. I want to add more to this, and she was totally correct. So let's talk about the stages. First stage of moral development is pre-conventional moral development, or pre-conventional. morality, in which case you're focused on yourself. It's a very selfish-oriented goal, as Gilligan would say, and you're motivated primarily by things like reward and punishment. So your only reason for doing something or not doing something would be, if I don't do this, I'm going to get punished. Or if I do this, I'm going to get rewarded. And that's the only reason you really have for taking action. The next stage is conventional morality, which is where Gilligan argues that you have this transformation from selfishness into a transformation of an idea that I have a responsibility to other people in some sort of sense. So, this is the idea that there is law and order, as Kohlberg would say. Your actions are guided by order and the law. So there's not much thought behind whether things are truly right or not. It's like, do the rules say that I should do this? Yes? Okay, I'm going to do it. Do the rules say I shouldn't do this? No? Okay, so I'm not going to do it. Or yes, okay, I'm not going to do it. And then Gilligan adds to this care aspect being like, I'm going to do something for someone else because I have a responsibility to them. And Kohlberg would say that I'm not going to rob a bank because it's against the law. Gilligan would also say that I'm not going to rob the bank because it would hurt the people that I'm robbing. So self-sacrifice, aka sacrificing your ability to make money so that other people can be better. Now, then we transition into the final stage, which is post-conventional morality. Post-conventional is more ethical principles, so it's holding thinking to a higher principle. It's maybe thinking that the law and the rules are not always right, that your reason for doing something should be on a higher order, should be based on some sort of social contract. So it's not like, I'm not going to hurt someone because it's against the law. It's, I'm not going to hurt someone because hurting people is bad and that's not something you should do. And then Gilligan would add to this saying that, like, you go from this form of selfishness in pre-conventional to responsibility to others in conventional to responsibility to both in post-conventional, saying that I'm a person as well and I don't need to sacrifice myself for other people, but I can also do things to bolster myself and improve this contract that we all live in. So I'm not going to hurt others. I'm not going to hurt myself. One important thing when it comes to these ideas of morality is that just because you're in a post-conventional state does not necessarily mean that you cannot do things based on a pre-conventional sense of morality. I still do actions because I'll get rewarded, and I don't do things because I won't get rewarded or I'll get punished. But I can also think in post-conventional, like, social contract ways. So they're not mutually exclusive, though you cannot think in a post-conventional way without first knowing how to think in a conventional and a pre-conventional way. In my own life, I've always been really, really fascinated by books and stories. I've been a huge reader since middle school, to the point where, like, in 6th grade, I was reading a book in class, hiding it under my desk, and my teacher had to, like, found out and had to take it away from me. So a lot of what I've gained from morality and my views on morality come from my own environment, but also come from the books that I've read. There's 2 books that I keep in mind when it comes to morality and how they flopped with me and had me warring inside. And I think it's really interesting when it comes to moral development in adolescence, because the thing is that authors write stories and have actions that their characters take, and they write in a way that tries to make you think that their actions are justified in some manner or whatever. So the first title that I put on here is Red Rising by Pierce Brown. And at the most general sense, this is a book about revolution. and a kid that ends up in a revolution and has to infiltrate others, and he creates close bonds with a lot of people that he's ultimately going to betray. And he's trying to war with these actions of how much do I betray these people, what's important to me. And I found myself really connecting with that idea, and yet as the author was writing, trying to say why one thing was morally okay for him to do while another was not, or why both things were morally right, I found myself flip-flopping against the author. Like, I was convinced at some points by his ideas, like, I should revolt because the laws in place and the system currently in place are antithetical to the happiness and well-being of many other people, a post-conventional state. And at the same time, that's what I'm thinking. And at the same time, many of the characters are thinking, I can't revolt against this system because it's the system and this is the way things need to be for order. And the author did a fantastic job of flipping and flopping and showing these two ideas, and I found myself being pulled along with them. And it wasn't until I reread this book many years later when I could read through all these chapters and not be like, oh yeah, he's right, wait a minute, he's not as right, but blah blah blah. The other book that I want to talk about is the Gentleman Bastard series, but most specifically The Lies of Lachlan Morrow, which is a fantastic book if you haven't read it. And this story follows a group of thieves, which you can see right away is going to have a lot of different moral grays. And the thing with reading moral grays, especially as an adolescent, is that you're very influenced by what the author says and how they want you to think. There was so much happening in the book that I never found my time to really think about the actions that were being taken. I took the author's justifications and the way that they wanted to convey the information at face value, and I never really thought about it. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. Or those are the bad guys and these are the good guys, but the good guys aren't necessarily good because they're thieves. My point behind all of this is that when I was reading, it was very difficult for me to maintain one specific set of moral principles about the characters and their actions. And now that I reread these books later, I don't have as much of a problem like being able to analyze, and I think part of that is just like reading the books with a different intent. But part of that is because I have my own ability to think in a post-conventional state, and I'm farther out of that adolescent stage where I'm so transient between all three of these that I'm able to view these actions with a more clear lens apart from what the author's trying to make you feel, which is admittedly difficult because these authors are so good. But I think for me, this is very representative of what many other people go through in the stage of adolescence, in that they're in a very transitive moment in their lives when it comes to moral development, and often the reasons they do things can vary wildly at any given moment. It's important for us to recognize that students can still be driven by these pre-conventional and conventional ideas, and we can use those to, not force them, but help guide their learning just by providing rewards and other things like that as they learn. But it's also important to remember that they're still developing these post-conventional ideas of morality, and a lot of times people don't always get to post-conventional morality even in their adulthood. And it's very important to be there because it allows you to view things through a much more generalized lens that's much more thoughtful and much more introspective. So we need to recognize that students can do things out of character, but we also need to recognize that we should help them develop these kinds of post-conventional moralities and think about why they do things, because often students aren't thinking about why they do things. And so my takeaway is that this is very transitive, and we need to recognize that their decisions aren't always based off of one sense of morality, but also that we need to encourage students to think about why they're doing things and why things are happening. So I teach history, or I want to teach history. So when we're talking about, court decisions or decisions that people make in history. It's not, I don't want to teach them just that it happened, but I want to ask them, why do you think people made these decisions, and help them come to develop their senses of post-conventional morality by being thoughtful about actions that are taking in the world today and in the past.